In this little video, I'm going to talk about the changes to glycolytic enzymes with exercise training. The three enzymes that we're really going to focus on again are kind of these rate-limiting or really important enzymes. The first enzyme is important is glycogen phosphorylase, and this is responsible for the reaction of breaking a glucose 6-phosphate molecule off of the polysaccharide glycogen, and then this can then proceed through glycolysis. The second is PFK. Again, this is the rate-limiting enzyme. It phosphorylates essentially a variance of this. So this adds the second ATP molecule to the glucose or glucose 6-phosphate, making it a doubly labeled, and it is the rate limiting step, meaning that the faster this enzyme produces or the more of it, the faster the flux through the glycolytic pathway would be, and therefore it makes sense to be a key enzyme that might be altered with training. The last is lactate dehydrogenase. So if you'll remember, this enzyme is actually for converting pyruvate to lactate and vice versa. And so we can imagine also that might come into play with exercise of being able to kind of keep glycolysis going. So what do we know? So long-term aerobic training, we can say for sure that it increases glycogen phosphorylase. So it enhances the ability to break off glycogen 6-phosphate from glycogen. PFK, that's a maybe. There's some studies that show that it does and some studies show that it doesn't. And then we can also say that LDH is improved as well. So at least 2 of the 3 and maybe all 3 are increased with aerobic training. In anaerobic training, it's actually interesting. The book talks about this in pretty good detail, but they actually show a decrease in PFK activity. What happens is the muscle grows. If we don't get more PFK in the muscle, then we have what's known as a dilution effect, right? So there's less PFK going around per unit area of muscle, and therefore the activity is decreased. With sprinting, they highlighted that it's sport-specific. So some of the really short training bouts may not have any effect on these enzymes, whereas some of the longer sprints do. Since we talked about glycogen phosphorylase, I'll add one more of what happens to glycogen content with exercise training. So first, if you do an acute intense bout of exercise, you can kind of heavily cut into the amount of glycogen that is stored in your muscle. For example, we have about enough glycogen to last about a couple hours of a moderate intensity exercise, about 50 to 60% of VO2 max. If we do intense training, we can cut our glycogen storage in half just by working out. So that makes it important for a couple reasons. One is that if you think about it, we need to replete this glycogen, so we need to replace what we lost, and so usually taking some type of carbohydrate in post-exercise is important for repleting this. Right? And that'll come into play in carbohydrate loading. So what happens to glycogen content with training? One, we get an overall increase in total glycogen content in the muscle. We'll talk about that how glycogen is really related to performance. So if we run out of glycogen, then our muscles will essentially come to a slow and grinding, really painful, very reduced performance. Okay. So an example of this is a marathon. A marathon, if you've ever heard the term a monkey jumping on your back, usually happens around in the 18 to 20 something miles, usually a couple hours after the beginning of the marathon, which directly relates to about the amount of time that we have for glycogen storage in our muscles. And so if you run out of glycogen, then your metabolism really slows to a halt. So we can imagine that increasing total glycogen in skeletal muscle will help improve performance very greatly. Second is, after a bout of exercise, we have an increased ability to put glycogen back into our storages and can build them back up much quicker than an untrained person. Which brings us to carbohydrate loading. So this is in a different section of the book. It's on page 256, and I encourage you to go read. It's about a page, and it talks about the idea of carbohydrate loading. So carbohydrate loading, maybe you were fed some information as a youngster that the day before the race you should just eat a whole bunch of pasta and carbs, and that would help you have more glycogen, and that would help you perform better. That's not really the way it works. So the original, very classic method was essentially a week long. So the first day of exercise, you did a long, strenuous, a couple hours to completely deplete glycogen and make it pretty miserable. You then did 3 days of low carb, essentially eating no carbohydrates at all, and continue to intensely exercise train. As you can imagine, this is not very much fun. Imagine waking up and eating on an empty stomach and not having your liver glycogen repleted to provide glucose. So imagine if your entire body is depleted of glycogen, just how difficult intense training is. And then the next 3 days, you would spend doing no training and just eating lots of carbohydrates. And indeed, you would eat about 90% of your diet would all be carbohydrates. So again, not the most I would say fun type of eating to kind of starve yourself of carbs, and then once you finally get them, you just binge on them. But it was very effective, so that you could more than double the amount of glycogen in your muscle. As you can imagine, though, this wasn't too well taken by the athletes, and now there's several different methods that don't quite come close to getting this level, but can heavily increase glycogen, again, by this term of supercompensation. So the same idea applies, is that you do some intense exercise to help deplete glycogen, and then you overfeed with carbohydrates to actually produce even more in the muscle, relying on that idea of increased rate of glycogen repletion once you're trained. So what happens to glycogen storage with resistance training? Little to no effect in resistance training. With sprint training, similar to the enzymes, specific to the exercise. Again, shorter sprints, shorter types of anaerobic activities aren't going to see much. Some of the longer durations, so if you're doing multiple like high intensity exercise bouts, then that can actually increase storage of glycogen in the muscle. That's just a really brief overview and a little mini video. I hope you enjoyed it.